project that Tim alluded to, the Marine Futures, which was funded by the Natural Heritage Trust. We basically worked from the Abrolhos to east of Esperance. Each one of these little red blocks is about 150 square kilometers in size, and we generated a habitat map for those areas, and then we went and dropped our cameras. This was, at the time, the single largest habitat mapping program in Western Australia. And as you can see from that, it's a drop in the ocean. So this goes back to my point about the fact that Western Australia's marine environment is largely unknown. In those areas, we had 1,500 drops of our camera systems, which you saw a little bit of the video earlier. It allows us to document size and abundance of fish. A very patient team back at UWA identified 322 species and counted and measured nearly 41,000 fish. So when we talk about having a baseline and having some understanding of the environment in Western Australia, it's based on numbers like that. And what did it tell us? It tells us in the first instance where are the fish and how many. So we have here examples of where we worked at Injitup and Cape Naturalist. We didn't do any sampling in that middle bit. And this is an underlying habitat map. And what those dots show is how much fish biomass, so the total weight of fish in those areas on a camera. And you can start to see that generally in the inshore areas there are more fish than outside. And that's important because everybody knows that, but it's never been documented. How many do we have? How big are they? We can also, oh no, what happened there? We can also look at individual species. So each of these drops, these little black dots, is where we drop the camera. And out of the 150 drops that we had 8 drops where they were western blue groper, and the most we ever saw was 2. So it starts to tell you where individual species are distributed. And this was a bit depressing because truly in inshore areas there should be more, and I'll talk a little bit more of that shortly. So why do we care where they are? I don't know if how many people saw the budget notes where they're actually going to put money into the Capes Marine Park, and make sure they do. Write them about the State Marine Park as well. But when we went through a planning process for where to have sanctuary zones in the southwest Cape, there were areas that were proposed as sanctuary zones. These are in the blue. And there were areas that were proposed as general use, remaining in multiple use where you can fish. This is the total number of fish. And what was interesting is the areas that were retained as open had more fish than the areas that people were willing to give up for sanctuary zones. And that was a consistent pattern across the years when we were sampling. So what that tells me is that we need to have a better understanding about what's out there so that we can make decisions, informed decisions on where we put our sanctuary zones, and not have a planning process where some people have more information than others, and we end up not having our sanctuary zones in the areas where we need them. So this is part of documenting that process. Empty forests. So if you go offshore Broke Inlet, so around the corner from Augusta, really big swell, far from jetties, pretty hard to get there. What we found from our many, many samples is that about 15% of the population of fish that you observe there are target species. Queen snapper, pink snapper, jewfish, western blue groper. About 15%. In the Capes, it's about 2%. So this isn't about different habitat. These are the same basic habitats in these areas. But what it is about is access. So we've actually managed in the Capes area, because we have jetties and lots of people coming down here fishing, is that we've reduced the target species from about 15% of the ecosystem to 2%, to the best of our knowledge. We also know from our cameras that we're seeing major declines in key target species. So this is work we've been doing at the Abrolhos Islands since 2005. And we've actually seen an 80% decline in red-throat emperor, both in deep and shallow waters, over the last 5 years. An 80% decline. And that's, if you actually look at the size, that's actually the large animals. That's not a lack of recruitment coming in. That's a removal of the mature large animals. And what we also know from this is that the number of locations where we see them has decreased from about 80% to 40%. So when you go out there and you drop your cameras, we've been doing the same thing since 2005, dropping our cameras. They're just not there. Possibly just environmental variability? Possibly. And what the Department of Fisheries has said is that many of our major species are overexploited, and that we need to reduce fishing mortality by 50% immediately. And what that means in terms of fishing mortality is that the number of fish that are caught and die as a consequence of that interaction is reduced by 50%. So that includes net fishing, where individuals actually drop out and still die and we don't count them. And it includes recreational fishing, where we catch them, release them, and they don't survive the entire interaction, by 50%. Now, the Minister for Fisheries has done a sleight of hand, for lack of a better word, and he's actually said that all we need to do is reduce fishing effort by 50%. But if the mortality doesn't decrease by 50%, we actually haven't achieved where we need to get to. So clearly, many of our iconic species are in trouble. So that has in part prompted a suggestion that we have large marine sanctuaries in Western Australia, both for biodiversity conservation, and I'm mostly talking about fish today, but I think the most important thing to realize also is that this southwest region is very important in terms of whales, dolphins, sponges. Nobody pays any attention to sponges, but we're a hotspot for sponge biodiversity. So it's not just about fish, but they're a good indicator of the protection that we need. So what do marine sanctuaries do, and why do we need them? So part of my goal tonight is to provide some of the science on why they work, and hopefully convince you that they're part of the package. And I'm going to talk about these three issues, which are the first, that we actually want to protect biodiversity. Having done that, they actually contribute to fisheries, and that they're part of ensuring that we've got a little bit of insurance in the system. So what do we know? A review in 2002, so that's almost a decade ago, showed that on average, in sanctuary zones where you can't fish or explore for hydrocarbons, that there are nearly 2 times more fish, that they're a lot bigger, 3 times bigger, and that even diversity goes up. And the most compelling one, I think, is from the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, where the legal size fish were actually 5 times higher in sanctuary zones than in areas open to fishing. Now, a lot of people now go, duh, if you can't fish them, of course there are going to be more of them. But 20 years ago and 10 years ago, when people started looking at this, they said, oh, it'll never work because the fish will just move in and out. You won't get any more. That's just dumb. But in fact, when people started collecting evidence about it, it was clear that you do get the accumulation of fish inside these sanctuary zones. And that's really important, because what you get in sanctuary zones are big, old, fat females. Imagine being valued for being old and fat, as well as being female. And this is an example from jewfish. So this is the number of eggs per female, and this is the size of the animals, and this is our minimum legal size. So our current regulations protect this amount of eggs. And all of this eggs is completely open to extraction and has no protection anywhere in this state. And not only is that important because there are more eggs, but the older you get, your eggs actually are better quality. It's not like being human, where they go downhill and you have to worry about it and your biological clock is ticking at 40. They actually get better. They're fatter, they're larger, and the recruits that come out of those eggs are stronger. And we are doing nothing in the state to protect that spawning biomass. And that applies to a range of species.